but the payment is not usually received until October of each year. So we're saying that even though it is a $1 million impact, we may be able to, we already don't receive it until October, so we don't feel that there's much impact here. A 2-month delay in the quarterly advance to counties for the early periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment program. This impact will be $600,000 to Budget Unit 4050 Mental Health. We typically get that in the early first few months of the year as well, so we don't foresee that being any different than what it has in the past in cash flow wise. And then additionally, as I reported on for the February 14th update, a $1 billion in cuts, further cuts for current fiscal year, with a 10% reduction in Medi-Cal payments to doctors and hospitals, primarily impacting the hospitals and providers. And I did get an update on the clinics. I wrote down here clinics, but the clinics are not going to get a reduction in the Medi-Cal payment reimbursement rate. So it may not affect them other than caseload requirements. In the public safety programs and grants, basically the governor proposes a reduction of $3.1 million. The impact to Mendocino County is unknown at this time, could impact various public health grants, the DA vertical prosecution grants, the CalMet grant, Budget Unit 0474.
Jennifer, could I back up?
Sure.
I have a question. The $1 billion in cuts for fiscal year with a 10% reduction in Medi-Cal payments to doctors and hospitals. How's this going to affect our first responder capability, our ambulance providers in this county? Is that also going to take a 10% reduction?
Well, Medi-Cal payments, any Medi-Cal payments with a reduction in the reimbursement rate, certainly there would be some impact there to our EMS providers who would be billing for Medi-Cal, yes.
Okay, that's going to be very serious in our rural county.
Depends on what the payer mix is on what they bill.
Sure.
I don't know.
Well, this county predominantly has a high rate of uninsured folks with emergency responses, so it's going to have a real impact. Please continue. Thank you.
So I believe that's the conclusion of the mid-year cuts. Is there any question on that before I move on to the 2008-09 state budget?
You've been such a provider of happy news.
That's me.
Any comments from the board so far?
Yeah, just to, as I said several times already today, I think if this was the worst it's going to get, I think we can live with it. But I don't think this is the tip of the iceberg, in my opinion, because the state's budget deficits are rising faster than what they're proposing to cut. That's just a fact.
Well, having retired from state service, there used to be a saying when I was working that it can't get any worse than this. Well, every year it proves that statement wrong, and we might survive this year, but don't expect things to improve next year. Has been my adage. So with no additional comments, let's move to 08-09.
Just a quick for instance, the governor proposing budget of $3.3 billion and more borrowing. I don't think that's going to happen. And even if they do go out and say, okay, we can borrow the money, one or two things are going to happen. They're not going to be able to borrow it, or they're certainly not going to borrow it at a rate that's
prime rate
budgeting. I mean, one city down south just went out for their borrowing and they come back at it was in the double-digit interest rates because of their credit rating. So I think that $3.3 billion that the budget governor's put in there and more borrowing, I think that's the first thing they're going to have to eliminate is that. So that's going to add on to what's it next year, starting July 12, 14, $15 billion. So, you know, they've been good about adding revenues on the revenue side to help them balance the budget, and then the revenues don't materialize, and so it gets worse. But the point of it is they're up against the amount that they can borrow from voter approval. They're up against that, up the wall there. So it's just gonna get much worse than what we're seeing here.
Okay. In the 2008-09 projections from the governor's office from January 10th, his spending plan of $100.99 billion represents a decrease of $2.375 billion, or 3% decrease over the prior fiscal year. Basically, he's projecting, his proposal is projecting a 10% across the board to all programs. For Mendocino County, this represents various impacts amongst various departments. A part of this proposal in detail I have listed is provisions for long-term average rates to deposits in the Revenue Stabilization Fund. If the revenue exceeds 10% of the general fund in a given year, then the excess will be transferred from the Revenue Stabilization Fund to the general plan, which will be available for one-time spending for schools, tax rebates, debt reduction, and capital projects. The second provision calls for projections during the year in November, January, and May through the end of the year, and if the general fund deficit shows a 1% or less, then the governor will reduce appropriations by 2%. So basically, the state's going to be, he's going to be reviewing, or he's projecting to review, as we do, a quarterly budget, you know, and looking at all of his revenues. If the 1%, if it goes below a 1%, then the governor will reduce the appropriations by 2%. If the projections are above 1%, then the governor will reduce appropriations by 5%. Reductions will remain in effect until the legislature acts by either a separate legislation or in the Budget Act to restore levels of services. This is a constitutional amendment, which we have at this time do not know will be going through. He's projected a $14.5 billion, which now it looks by the LAO and their recommendations has increased another $2 billion. So, and that's primarily due to overestimated revenues. His calculations for his accrual methods of accounting, in that he's delaying payments and allocating those revenues in the fiscal year, the next fiscal year, which has been overstated as well. Not to mention other appropriations that have increased or were not taken into account. So for Mendocino County, our impacts for 2008 or 9 are the library. Impact to budget unit 6110 is approximately around $35,000. In the Health and Human Services Agency, CalWorks is projected to have approximately $1.1 million in lost benefits to recipient families. Child Welfare Services, in the impact to Mendocino County is approximately $705,000, which would require the elimination of 9 child welfare services staff positions. The loss of these positions would almost guarantee the inability to meet state and federal mandates in the provisions of child welfare services, and would end the improvements in the provisions of these services achieved over the past several years. Foster care is the impact to Mendocino County is approximately $810,000. IHSS, or in-home support services, the impact to Mendocino County is approximately $1,047,000. Of this, $272,000 would be cut from the program's administration, which would require the reduction of 4 social worker positions. The remaining $775,000 would be in lost wages to the IHSS providers. The Medi-Cal eligibility services, the impact to Mendocino County is approximately $426,000, which translates into a reduction of 7 staff. As I continue on here, as you can see, these are huge impacts. The SSI, SSP budget, the budget suspends the June 2008 and 2009 COLAs for the blind, aged, and disabled. The impact to Mendocino County is the loss of approximately $1 million in benefits to these individuals.